Hello and welcome to the World Today. Mexico is a critically important country in South America, both because of the strength of its economy, or rather the size of its economy. It's the second largest in the continent, and because its proximity to the United States. Since the election of President Nieto some years ago, the country has experienced crisis after crisis, economically, in terms of the role of the mafias that are active in the country, the drug mafias being in the prime place, the earthquake, the decline in living standards, every single criteria this government has failed. And yet, reading one's Financial Times, early in the morning, you get a report which says that the PRI deserves to win again, purely for the reasons of stability and continuity, and the fact that voting for the opposition candidate, AMLO as he is popularly known, his initials, would be a leap into the dark. Whatever happens, this country is now in a severe crisis of confidence, a severe crisis in terms of its inability to deal with absolutely crucial problems. Whether AMLO will be able to deal with them is a different question altogether. With me, or rather in Brooklyn, in New York, is Tony Wood, a writer and essayist who is currently working on a PhD on Latin America at New York University. Tony, welcome. Great to have you on the show again.
Thanks, Tariq.
Could you give us just a brief resume? You were in Mexico very recently, on what the situation is before we move further.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, the elections are coming up in July, and it's a very long campaigning season. So all of the leading contenders have been positioning themselves already, even though officially the campaign has yet to start. So the current situation is that all of the candidates are gathering signatures, which for the main contenders should not be a problem at all. So there's Lopez Obrador, the main, who's leading the field. There's the PRI party candidate, Jose Antonio Meade, the former finance secretary. There's another candidate running for an alliance of the center-right Catholic party, the PAN, plus what used to be the center-left PRD party, the PRD. He's called Ricardo Anaya, and he is sort of a Mexican wannabe Macron clone, if you will. Those are the ones who are definitely going to be able to run, and then there are a couple of more candidates who may or may not make it onto the list who are going to be of much lesser importance. The only one who it's interesting to see what happens is the candidate for the National Indigenous Council, a woman called Maria de Jesus, her abbreviated name is Marichui. And she is going to run in order to raise awareness of a lot of different social issues affecting the indigenous population in Mexico. But of course, for the very reason she is running, it's quite hard for her to gather signatures officially certified by the Electoral Institute. So she may or may not make the list. But it's interesting because that marks a participation of the Zapatistas in a national presidential election in some form, because they have endorsed her. So that's an unusual development. And that may possibly subtract a few votes from Lopez Obrador. But as you mentioned, he's definitely the strongest candidate and the one to beat.
Tony, you'll recall, since you visit the country regularly, that when Nieto was elected, there was a whole media hype about him. A young president, you know, good looking, he's going to solve all our problems. But that all, I mean, ended very rapidly as we got into his presidency. What do you think were the main events in his presidency till now that have brought him down in the opinion polls, in public opinion, and made the PRI an unlikely winner in the next election?
I think, I mean, to some extent, the wave of enthusiasm in the foreign financial press about Peña Nieto was always artificially cultivated, I mean, and very deliberately sought by the new Mexican, the elite who came in with Peña Nieto, his team, his finance minister in particular, a man called Luis Videgaray, who went to college with Jared Kushner, so he has an in with the Trump White House. And this man was reportedly the brains behind the Peña Nieto presidency and its economic program. And I think the rumor is that it's through him that these US financial press gave him such, you know, positive coverage. And Time magazine said Peña Nieto was the man of the year who was going to save Mexico, or something like this. Not man of the year, but the man to save Mexico. That evaporated fairly quickly because the economic indicators were not any better than before. But the major event that really undermined Peña Nieto's presidency, well, there were two. One was a series of student protests, and then following on from that, there was the disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa.
What was that? Could you explain that in a bit more detail, the disappearance of the students?
This was a teacher training college, I guess you'd call it in English, in the state of Guerrero in the south of Mexico, which is one of the poorest states, if not the poorest state, and it's in a rural area. And this is a very, one of the few remaining vestiges of the old revolutionary heritage of Mexico, if you like. These were set up in the 1920s to train teachers, and it had a very radical curriculum. I mean, the murals in the school have Marx and Lenin on the walls, so it's a very strong but isolated remnant of the revolutionary tradition that's still going. And these students, they have a tradition of commandeering buses to go and attend a protest in Mexico City every October. And that's what happened in 2014. They were commandeering the buses to attend this protest. The story is very, very complicated and murky, and it's not really clear. Different law enforcement bodies seem to have participated in the kidnap and disappearance of these 43 students. And that very much undermined the credibility of the Peña Nieto government, simply because the government immediately went into full cover-up mode. And they found some culprits from the local, you know, drug mafias to take the blame for it, and they also put out false versions about what had happened to the students' bodies. I mean, this is really horrific stuff for the families of the students. So the whatever public trust there had been in this government was just destroyed at that point. And this was only barely 2 years into Peña Nieto's reign. Added to that, I think the other reason that the case of the 43 students was so emblematic is that it condensed all in one incident everything that's wrong with Mexico at the moment. There is just the total impunity of law enforcement agencies, the way in which young people are just being disappeared day after day and no one even knows where their bodies are buried. And the government has no interest in putting a stop to this or giving accountability, but instead is only interested in covering up what actually happened. So I think that really, for a lot of people, was the expression in Spanish is the drop that made the glass overflow.
Coming now to Lopez Obrador. He's lost the last two elections. The first of those, it was widely alleged, was a result of vote rigging and ballot rigging on the part of the government of the day. And many people who disliked AMLO said that this was probably the case. The second one we were less sure of, but again, similar charges were laid. But on the first, there was pretty much unanimous agreement that that had happened. What are the guarantees, before we move on to how he's changed, that this won't happen again?
I don't think there are any guarantees it won't happen again. I think it's very probable there will be something like this. And there is the reason to think this is just last summer in June, there was a state governorship election in the state of Mexico, which sort of surrounds the capital. And that state has for years been a bastion for the PRI. But what happened in the election was that it was a very narrow victory for the PRI. Obtained seemingly through all kinds of violations, intimidation, violence against supporters of the leading opposition party. The other very important thing about that election was that the leading opposition party in that election was not one of the established parties. MORENA, it's called, the Movement for National Regeneration. It was a new left party that was set up by Lopez Obrador originally in 2012 as a movement, and then in 2014 as an official party. And it's well positioned in a lot of races for governorships and municipalities next summer. If Lopez Obrador wins the presidential election, this could also boost the party's fortune. So what you're seeing is a kind of decomposition of the existing party system, and this new party is moving into some of that vacuum. And I think you'll see these party machines will do whatever it takes to try and block Morena from winning both local power, state power, and at the presidential level, I'm sure we'll see some violations of this kind, unfortunately.
So it'll be anyone but AMLO yet again. That is the aim of the parties.
I think that's the aim.
Yeah. What about AMLO himself, Tony? He's shifted a bit since he set up this new party. The people he's now presenting who would be in AMLO Cabinet are, quite interesting people as individuals, but they don't project any collective sense of people with a clear project, points A, B, C, D, and E, which have to be implemented come what may. They're all interesting themselves, Harvard-trained economists, people active in social life here and there, and respected as such. And is this his way of telling the international financial institutions in particular that don't worry too much, we are going to carry through real reforms, but nothing that you should be troubled about?
Yeah, I think that's very much part of the message he wants to send. I think it's a balancing act in some ways, that he's trying to convey to a domestic audience that he's not just bringing in a bunch of cronies. He's not bringing in some, people who have been with him in his left party, the previous left party, the PRD. He's not, because the mood in Mexico is very anti-establishment, I think.
And anti-political parties.
Yeah. And I think if Lopez Obrador is going to win, it will be through capitalizing to some extent on that mood. And the big advantage that his party, Morena, has is that it's precisely not an established machine party. And so people who are interested in backing social movements, or who have some who have broadly left politics but are very disenchanted with the existing political parties on the left of the spectrum, Morena is their channel. And I think his choices for cabinet are designed to sort of seem to appeal beyond party sentiment, certainly, and to convey a certain kind of expertise, if you will, but not in a technocratic IMF dictated kind of way.
So this would be, were Obrador to win, I mean, I know we say this now at every presidential election in Mexico almost, we would be able to say, even in a sort of the most modest sense, it's a reversal of the trend that we've seen in Argentina and Brazil, that you have a president elected who is not a creature of the global establishment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see if he is elected how much of a sort of progressive pink tide type of program he's able to implement. For example, the electoral alliance that AMLO has put together for the election includes a very socially conservative right-wing party called I think it's called the Social Encounter Party, which has very clear sort of anti-gay marriage, anti-abortion positions. So people are wondering how that agenda is combinable with Morena's more progressive left-wing agenda and what kind of concessions will be made, what this other party is bringing to the table. Certainly people on the left in Mexico are not trying to get too optimistic because there will be various constraints on Lopez Obrador, and they're not quite sure what deals will have to be made to get him in power. The other point of concern for people is that recently in Mexico, I think it was just passed in December at high speed, was a new internal security law, which is very concerning. It's designed to normalize the use of the military to police the country effectively. There are, in theory, legal sort of restrictions on the deployment of the military within Mexico's borders, and this law is designed to smooth those away so the military can now deal with the drug war, supposedly. But this is a very dangerous legal move. And Lopez Obrador was initially very critical of this law, but then now he's positioning himself as a sort of viable presidential candidate. He's making noises about how to reform security, and many of the things he's saying are actually consonant with the new security law and what the right has been saying for a long time.
In a way, the more important question is, how is he, or almost any president elected in Mexico, even more radical than him, let's say, going to deal with the drug gangs and the cartels, which has been a continuous problem now for decades, Tony. And it's not an easy thing. I mean, you just can't come up with one solution because it's so deeply embedded in almost every layer of this state. That's the problem. Does he say anything about that? I mean, everyone says, yes, we're going to end it, but, are there any concrete measures being proposed?
Yeah, it's not really. His proposals have been quite vague, I think, as far as I'm aware on this. I mean, he's talked about certainly ending the drug war, which may just be a question of emphasis or labeling. He's also raised the prospect of an amnesty for select criminals. It wasn't really clear who would be included in the amnesty, and certainly the Mexican media and civil society were up in arms about this. And I mean, you're absolutely right. This is very much embedded in the Mexican state at all levels, and also in different parties as well, because the main parties in Mexico are all, they each hold governorships of the different states, either separately or in coalition. They're each imbricated with whichever local crime structures, as far as I can see. I mean, there are some staggering figures on the amount of corruption over the past few years, and several governors have, salted away millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts or wherever they've put it. So the corruption is really the main thing that helps the drug war be sustained.
Well, I mean, we know from numerous books and journalistic exposes that have been published that the military is involved, the judiciary is involved, the police is involved, politicians are involved, big business is involved. I mean, you feel you need a sort of repeat of the Mexican Revolution of the 20s to wipe this out, that no elected leader is going to be able to do this. But anyway, we'll see. If we move on to social problems, you wrote a very fine blog in the London Review of Books on the earthquake, because you were in Mexico City when it happened. Could you describe that a bit, that experience of being in the city when actually the earthquake was happening, and the response to it?
I'd not been in Mexico City during an earthquake before, and obviously they happen quite frequently at a low level. And it's just part of the safety routine of the going into any building. Where the gathering points are for an earthquake. So it's part of the normal landscape for many Mexicans. But for me, it was the first time I'd experienced that. So that was, novel and not pleasant.
Iniciamos en México, donde continúan las labores de rescate en los diversos estados de la región central de ese país tras el terremoto de magnitud 7.1 que provocó graves daños a infraestructuras y la muerte de hasta el momento de 225 personas según la última cifra oficial. Junto a cientos de voluntarios, las autoridades mexicanas siguen trabajando para rescatar a las personas que quedaron atrapadas debajo de los escombros durante el sismo.
One of the very striking things about it was that everyone was immediately thinking back to the very large earthquake in Mexico City in 1985. And people who were old enough to remember, certainly that was their instant point of comparison. And I mean, luckily, the damage was nowhere near as bad in terms of buildings damaged or lives lost. Nothing compares with that. And I think that's partly because of safety measures and building codes that were improved after that earthquake. Another very, in some ways, positive legacy of that earthquake appeared very quickly. Within, I would say, a couple of hours of the earthquake happening this last September, there were already teams of volunteers putting together sort of food supply chains, volunteers helping to pick people out of the rubble. I mean, an incredible outpouring of a civic solidarity that was not directed from above, not directed by any organization or political party or anything like this. It was very spontaneous action of the citizenry, which I found very moving, and that was really impressive. I mean, in terms of its social consequences, obviously the earthquake struck the city very unevenly. There were more prosperous parts of the city that were damaged, and also much poorer parts of the city that were very badly damaged. And the media attention given to the different parts of the city was very striking. That some places were more deserving of a camera crew and round-the-clock coverage than other places. That was immediately very apparent. And I think, unfortunately, that is going to be the case in terms of the recovery, which, again, the city returned to normal seemingly within a couple of weeks. Businesses were working again, people were going to work, transport was very functional almost straight away. But there are still many sort of badly damaged buildings which have not come down. There are still people camped out in tents waiting to be rehoused. I think people have been lulled into this sense that the situation is not as bad as 1985 and therefore it is not that bad. But actually there are many people who are, still homeless. And this is very, very concerning.
Tony, moving on to foreign policy, would an Obrador government have any impact on that? Or is the relationship with the United States almost like the drug mafias in Mexico, so deeply embedded that with the best will in the world, it's going to be difficult to shift that too much? Despite Trump's comments about Mexicans, despite his plans on NAFTA, cutting down immigration, building walls. I mean, a lot of that hasn't been done as yet. But do you think Obrador might have the population, at least, on his side, were he to shift a tiny bit away from this alliance?
Certainly, you could see an increase in the rhetorical temperature with an Obrador government. Concretely, in terms of policy, a lot depends on what the US does about NAFTA, I think. If the US really does dismantle NAFTA, then it might even be that before Obrador or anyone else comes to power, they have to respond and come up with some strategy. The current government's response to the end of NAFTA, I think what they would do is actually more free trade, and they would form free trade pacts with other Latin American countries, or they would try and revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that would be a disaster of a different kind. I think Lopez Obrador, if he got into power, would not do that. He would probably diversify Mexico's trade relations. He would try and reduce the dependence on the US, which I think currently consumes something like 80% of Mexico's exports, non-fuel exports. So it's possible that there would be a simultaneous raising of the rhetorical temperature and an attempt to diversify the export base, but how successful that would be remains to be seen. It's also possible that Obrador or any other Mexican government is counting on Trump eventually being removed from office and they would have a different person to deal with, so that it would not be worth risking too much in the next few years in case someone more amenable comes to power in Washington. So I think there's probably a lot of different kinds of calculations going on in Mexico. The real problem is that the economic basis of the Mexican-US relationship is very, very hard to shift. The dependency between the two is so close that it would take, I think, a lot of time and a lot of conscious state policy to shift that. There's an expression in Mexican Spanish, at least, where if someone is disoriented, you say they're norteado, northed, as it were. So there's the pun in Mexico that the Mexican economy is very norteada, overly directed towards the north. But that's not a simple thing to change.
I mean, what some other South American countries have done, you know, despite their attitude to the United States, or not necessarily because of it, is opened up links with the Chinese and the Russians, who see the continent, I mean, quite strategically. I mean, the Russians are helping the but trading with the Cubans again, reopening some old links. The Chinese are, of course, angry with some countries who they feel have let them down. But by and large, they are in South America. So in terms of sort of transferring some of these exports and having new treaties with some of the United States' economic rivals like Russia and China is not such a far-fetched thing to do for any government, really.
No, I don't think so. And I think certainly, I mean, these were among the things that were being considered in the 1990s by Mexican governments on a more kind of neoliberal line. They were certainly very interested in Pacific trade relationships. And I think to some extent that would be true whatever the political complexion of the government. I think diversifying their economic relationships would be an obvious thing for a Mexican government to do. I mean, one of the major things that is on the agenda currently, or has been for several years and won't go away, is what will happen to the Mexican state oil company, Pemex, which is really a kind of sacred cow of Mexican politics since it was nationalized in 1938 by expropriating various US-owned oil companies, and since then it has been untouchable. And more recently, certainly the Peña Nieto government, and actually I think the Calderón government before it, what they've been trying to do is loosen the restrictions on foreign capital's involvement in the Mexican oil industry, which a large chunk of Mexican public opinion, not just the left, sees as a kind of stealth privatization. But then weighed against that, of course, is the environmental question and whether one wants to be drilling further into the Gulf and bring out all of this oil. So that is certainly a question that Lopez Obrador would handle differently from any other Mexican government. He would be very keen to protect the state-directed nature of Pemex, and I mean, it doesn't play quite the same role as PDVSA in Venezuela, but certainly a Lopez Obrador government would see it as a cornerstone of a more developmentalist kind of thinking.
Tony, last question. The Zapatistas, for the first time, as you've said, are backing the indigenous candidate. But what if she doesn't get the requisite number of signatures to stand as president? Would they then retreat into their traditional passivity in the face of national politics? Or might some of them be tempted, just in order to get the PRI out, to vote for Lopez Obrador?
I'm not sure if their position on this has moved at all recently, but I would doubt it. I think they would see the candidacy of Marichuy as the only real viable means of participation for them in the election, which itself is a protest vote of an important kind. Yeah. But if she doesn't gather the signatures, if she's not allowed on the ballot, I think they would take that as grounds for grounds for boycotting the entire process. And I certainly don't think they see AMLO as representing any part of their agenda. I think, for example, they boycotted the elections in 2006.
He had a much more radical program.
He had a much more radical program, and it was he seemed much more likely to win. But I think on that occasion, they really didn't see him as being outside the existing party system at all. I don't know if that's changed with Morena. I'm not really clear the extent to which the Zapatistas would sympathize more with a political movement that has more of a connection to the left social movements in Mexico, more people coming out of that tradition in its ranks. But I doubt that they would trust Lopez Obrador enough to call for a vote for him. I think the more likely thing would be a boycott, yeah.
Tony, on that note, we bring this interview to an end. Thanks very much, and we'll no doubt be talking about it again well before July.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Great to talk to you.